Very good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar on communicating strategically in a crisis. The first few things I'll be touching on will be just an introduction of what crisis communications is all about. We'll be talking, and then we'll be looking at some strategies, and then we'll take questions at the end of the talk. Okay. First up, usually when we talk about communications, we really are looking at no one, however well practiced they are in corporate communications, can say that they have a monopoly on wisdom on how to communicate well or effectively. Essentially, it's really much about looking at best practices. There's lots of trial and error. So in all humility, we're not presenting ourselves as well. Every time we manage crisis comms, we get it right. There will be times there will be the more we try to do, the worse it gets. So that's why it's important for people to learn from the mistakes of others, and we are looking at it very much from a best practices viewpoint. Okay, now so when we talk about best practices for crisis comms, we really need to be guided by some of these philosophies or concepts. Okay, first up, I would say that crisis communications should be part of the management decision-making process. In other words, top management in any kind of organization, it is important that there is a proactive participation by management in wanting to make decisions as far as what information to divulge, how to communicate, what to communicate, when to communicate, and so on. So these should be at the highest levels. It has to have the support of top management. It cannot be just a function of functional operations for the comms people to handle. Okay. Another thing that we've learned from best practices really is about planning for crises ahead of time. It's always best to be to know your own industry well, to know what are the pitfalls, and to be prepared, right? So how do you stay prepared? It's really about planning by identifying potential risks and hazards. What are the areas that are most likely to affect your operations? Another area is, of course, keeping if a crisis, or if there's a product failure, or anything that involves your products and services, of course it is, and if it's becoming public, if the information is public, then the question then is how to communicate to the public so that they are informed. In other words, you need to own the narrative. You need to be in charge. You need to take charge of communicating with people, and then keeping sure that your side of the story is correctly framed and communicated effectively. Okay. Another concept, another guiding principle really is about understanding the audience. You know, when we are communicating in a crisis, it is important to understand what drives them, what are their concerns, of course, and what are the information that they need to assure them, and so on. I think right now, the COVID-19 environment, for example, shows that there is obviously a concern of many people, right? From how to stay safe from the virus, how to recognize signs and symptoms, what are things that people can do to prevent the spread, and so on. So these are key questions that will be foremost on the minds of the public. So understanding their concerns, understanding their worries, and so on, and of course responding to that appropriately. Okay. One of the most important thing I think about communicating, whether we're handling crises or not, really is about honesty. Because any organization that has to engage or wants to be respected by the public must always be honest. This is more appropriate now, because is as appropriate now as it is in previous years, because when people have access to information, chances are that they will uncover the truth themselves anyway. So any organization that is less than transparent and honest will eventually be found out. So really no point about, there's no purpose in being less than honest. So honesty is paramount. Now, another aspect that guides people, and of course from how people derive best practices, is really about developing a pre-crisis network of credible sources to collaborate with. So for example, if you are a restaurant, for example, and there are some issues, you've encountered a um, food contamination issue, then the question then is, who are the people that you can work with to get to re-establish your credibility? For example, you can always say that we are looking for new certification. Our premises are inspected by the health authorities and so on. The people that we collaborate with to help us deliver a better product or service can be your allies. Is the point about this, because because they can vouch for how well or how competent you are in doing your work. So having a network of sources to collaborate with to help you put across your messages of competency is important. Another area that a lot of people tend to forget is really in this case, media. The news media is a very strong news ally. Is a very strong ally to have when, for example, you need to communicate with a lot of people, and of course to put your side of the story. So it's about maintaining effective communications with the news media in this case. News media, like I said, right now, in an era where fake news and rumors are being spread on unreliable sources of information, it is very good to have the news media as an ally. And how do we get them to be an ally? Really falls on us maintaining good communications with the media, building trust, making the media recognize that you are a trustworthy organization and that the information that you provide is accurate. Okay. Another thing about another aspect of communications really is about gaining trust, gaining recognition, and so on with the people that we address, right? So how do we do that? We really have to communicate, in other words, with compassion, concern, and empathy, right? How do we come across as authentic? How do we come across as believable? Really is the outcome of people communicating with compassion and concern. So it's about being genuine, in other words. So you have to, and of course, it helps that you relay, ensuring that the tone of your communications will show that you're compassionate or you're concerned. Okay. Another thing that we need to as communicators, we need to know that when we are handling or we're in the midst of a crisis, there will be uncertainty and ambiguity. So we shouldn't be thrown off by, with uncertainty and ambiguity. We still need to get things done. We still need to get the job done. So it's about finding your footing, staying on top of things, of course, and being comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. A lot of people will find that it can be paralyzing if there's fear and ambiguity. So not to allow that uncertainty and ambiguity sort of paralyze you. So it's important to be able to figure things out and work with a clear mind. Last point about best practices really is about message. When you're crafting messages, it has to be carefully crafted and released at the appropriate juncture. In other words, information that's being shared must be verified. You must be comfortable that it's accurate and that it is. If it's phased, if it's information that is coming out in phases, it has to be done at the right time, in anticipation for the needs of information. Okay, moving along, right? So the reason why I put this topic up front after best practices really is about the fact that in dealing with a crisis, no one person will be handling a crisis. It's really about handling it with the help of employees and so on. So employees of any organization should be the first to know about the crisis, should be the first to be kept in touch, kept informed, because they are the people that we are tapping on to handle a crisis. So very much so, its internal comms must be effective. There must be a network of information that effectively reaches them and preps them to know what to do. Some of these pointers includes communicating quickly. Employees should never find out about crisis from the media. They should find out internally, be it staff emails or telegram chats or whatever it is. They should be the first to know should there be a reason to handle crises internally. Okay, having core messages. What do we mean by core messages? Really, sometimes every organization sometimes needs to be reminded what is their main mission, what is their mission, what is the thing that they set, what are the goals, corporate goals, and so on. All these corporate goals, all your mission statements should be incorporated in some of these messages during times of crisis, because it reminds people of the what are the key tasks on hand at hand. So it's important that they should be reminded of that, and it's a useful time to have that reminder as employees start to grapple with or handle a crisis. Okay, when in a crisis especially, you have to communicate regularly with your staff to ensure that they have full information, to have as much information as they can, to help them understand the situation, and of course to help them understand what needs to be done. Okay, of course, it helps to give as much information as is appropriate to communicate. These, because of the complexities of crisis, sometimes there's some information that needs to be, if it's not verified, for example, if it's not clear, then maybe you may decide to release information as it is confirmed, rather than just giving out information when it is when it is not confirmed. I say this because there are times when information is clear, clearly facts, and other times it could be speculation or conjecture. So when information shows that that some data, some information points are just estimates or guesses, those are not facts. Those should not be communicated. Communicate what we know for certain. Okay. And of course, in sharing information with employees, it's important to know why some information is confidential and why such information cannot be discussed, depending on the types of operations. Some information can be sensitive, price sensitive, or sensitive to competitors and so on. So there are times when it is for certain reasons, business reasons, operational reasons, then those information can be shared or should not be shared as deemed by management. So there's no necessity to really publicly share all information. Moving on. Yep. Now, when decisions have to be made, it's important that sometimes decision makers and reasons why we make decisions should be shared. So it's important that if there are changes in directions, for example, then and if the information is not confidential, it's important to share the decision-making factors and criteria with employees to help them understand the job. And of course, it builds trust. Employees will appreciate the sharing by their management for ways for why decisions are made. I think that builds trust, and it sort of gets buy-in from staff, rather than just say this is the directions we're taking and take it and leave it. So it is about this is one area that I feel personally that, you know, in making decisions, it's also, as we communicate, we are also building relationships in the process. Okay, it's not just about saying that this is a decision made and we go with that. And I think that I think if people were to use communications in that way, it alienates employees rather than build trust with them. Another thing about communicating effectively with employees is really about announcing difficult decisions such as retrenchments or plant closings in a fair and compassionate manner. When when announcing bad news, for example, it's always important to show that the information that's being shared is taken seriously, and that there are it's okay to express regret. Even it's okay to express that it's a difficult time, and to use the tone of communication should be appropriate to the subject topic. In communicating with employees, it's always good to give opportunities to employees to ask questions, offer feedback, make suggestions, and so on. When communicating, especially, and when there's feedback, the feedback should be attended to. People who, decision makers especially, should listen out, because another thing that I'm particularly mindful of is that the best communicators are also the ones who listen, are good listeners, are empathetic listeners. Okay. Another good old principle about communicating whether or not in a crisis really is about treating employees the way you expect to be treated. In other words, when you treat your employees respectfully, it should be the employees will appreciate that, and of course they will also be more forthcoming with information, and it sort of builds trust. This is all about exercise and building trust. And of course, ensuring that all employees are told about important news at the same time. In other words, there should not, if employees are told information at different times by different people, there's always this fear that because people already talk among themselves, if information is not shared with one group or the other, then there will be cause for speculation and so on. So it's best to make sure that all employees are informed at about the same time, to avoid misunderstandings and so on. So again, like I said, communicating is about managing those relationships as well. Okay. And I think one point that I think in dealing with crisis comms, especially even for internal staff, internal communications, is really about using an effective spokesperson. Spokesperson should be able to understand messages and to deliver messages or convey messages in a clear and empathetic way. Okay. And of course, last but not least, it's really about when communicating with employees, it's really to provide a call to action. In other words, when information is shared with people, especially with staff, what is the reason for that communication? Why are we sharing this information with them? Is that a reason to? Is there a reason for the information that we're sharing? Is it something that we want them to follow up and do and so on? So it's very important to make sure that there are clear calls to action embedded in the communications. Okay, let me take a pause and catch my breath. Hold on. Okay, the next point that I hope all of you are following quite clearly. Yeah. Okay. Now, so far we've talked about best practices in managing or communicating in a crisis. Then we looked at managing internal communications because, like, as I mentioned before, employees are our ambassadors. Employees are the very hands and legs, the all hands on deck, right? The people, our allies that will help us manage the situation and of course to communicate. So, so with that in mind, let's move on to our next topic, which really is about communicating in a crisis. Okay. Now, when we talk about communicating in a crisis, it is important. It is important to know what to say and do. Again, these pointers that I'm sharing really comes from a variety of best practices, a variety of learnings from case studies, established case studies that we have. Okay. First up really is about identifying the various publics. Publics here means the people, external parties, the people external to our organizations who may be affected by or expect to be informed about a crisis. So it is important to know who we need to speak to first in any crisis. Who are the most important stakeholders, okay, that we need to address. What are their concerns and why and how we should communicate with them effectively. Okay. Another thing is as we start to communicate in a crisis, we also have to demonstrate, okay, that we have identified a problem and are doing something about it. That's the first thing, because if a company feels that a crisis is already public when people are talking about it, and then not sort of acknowledge that, right? I think that the problem will then be that the public may feel that the company is being a bit maybe hiding something or not addressing it thoroughly. So it's important to mention that yes, this is the problem that we acknowledge. This is the problem that we have identified and what we are doing about it. Again, just as we need to have core messages with our employees, it is also important to mention core messages to the appropriate publics. These core messages may be crafted for a variety of reasons. Some of it may be to address an issue. Some of it may be to address concerns. Okay, so it's important to know, like I said, these are best practices, but you must understand the context in which the crisis has occurred, so that you can know what are key things to share, what key information to share, and how best to phrase those information. Okay. Again, when in communicating in any crisis, we need to communicate only what we are sure of. So if the things are factual, things that have been investigated, that we have facts, only hard facts should be communicated. If anything is uncertain or at best just a guess or speculation, then those information should not be shared. Okay, because it is not helpful to give out information that is inaccurate at best. Okay, and of course not to make up information and so on. That's the worst thing. If you are in a situation where you have to share facts and at the moment those facts are not available, it is absolutely fine to say that the information is not available. Okay, so better than the important thing is not to tell untruths or to lie. Okay. Also, in communicating in the crisis, there will be situations where there might be hypothetical situations. An example of a hypothetical situation is if someone says that what if the in the current COVID environment, if someone were to ask, what if the social distancing efforts that are being enforced isn't working, isn't turning out to be effective, for example, what should we do? In that case, that is hypothetical because so far it has just been implemented, right? So there is no evidence to show that it isn't working yet. So do not comment on a hypothetical situation. In that case, that means we must understand the facts. If I were handling the comms for the COVID environment and someone were to ask that question, my answer to them is this distancing, these social distancing measures have only just been implemented, right? I would say that it is, give it time to prove itself, because we cannot jump to the point where we don't comment on something that is hypothetical or hasn't happened just yet. I think just to be safe, because later on it will come. It may in a highly fluid situation, it may complicate matters. So it's okay to acknowledge that something is hypothetical, that we do not want to comment on hypothetical situations. In communicating to stakeholders, it is always important to show accessibility and that we are communicative. Accessibility here means that we are accessible. It's easy to contact us. It's easy to get in touch with us, and so on. Okay. In knowing what to say to do, it's always useful to be decisive, make clear decisions. Keeping the cool is very important in this case, because losing your cool is not good public relations to begin with, and it may complicate matters. And last but not least, it's important never to say no comment, especially to the news media, because the words no comment really tells people either it may convey the sense that there is something to hide, or that people are guilty. So it's best not to say no comment. Use the opportunity. If asked the question that you don't have the answer to, for example, or if asked the question regarding some facts that you should not be divulging at that point in time, use that opportunity to present facts. Use that opportunity to talk about what you can talk about, but don't say no comment, because no comment shows that you are not quite prepared. Okay. Also, it means knowing what to say and do in a crisis. Is always good to communicate all the bad news at one time. Don't in other words, when we are communicating, use the opportunity to share information, as much information as we have at one time, rather than to realize that we may have withheld some information for whatever reason, right? All of us are imperfect. All of us can make mistakes. If we don't communicate effectively, sometimes there will be times when we overlook some information and so on. So it's best to communicate, to provide as much information at one go. As with all communications form, whether it's internal or external, it's always important to make sure that there is, as we communicate, that there's an opportunity to entertain feedback, to listen to feedback. And because feedback is important, because it gives us an opportunity to address whether or not there are needs for information that we did not address. Okay. And of course, in any form of situation, sorry, in a crisis situation, especially when there is public communications or external communications, it's good to keep a record of those communications, because these records show whether or not we have truly addressed or we have been effective in addressing concerns. Okay, monitoring, monitoring and evaluating a situation really looks at whether or not there's public discussions, looking at public forums, looking at news clippings, looking at information that has been shared with the public, and then seeing how people react to that information, and seeing how people comment on that situation, because feedback, that's a form of feedback, and that would help us become better communicators. And of course, in a crisis situation, it's useful to keep communicating, right? Not to stop communicating, because otherwise there will be communicate regularly, because if you once you stop or you don't communicate regularly, again, like at the height of any situation, people will start wondering, is there some, why has information, why has the flow of information suddenly ceased? Okay. Some learning points to focus on basically in crisis comms is really, if a mistake has been made, it's okay to admit that mistake, that there have been lapses, that people have in trying to in delivering products and services, that a mistake has been made. It's okay to admit that mistake. Okay. Useful to apologize as well. Again, like I said, from a communicator standpoint, it's always important to communicate with a mindset that as we communicate, we are building, we are establishing, we are cementing relationships. So it's okay to use these measures as an organization to show the human side of an organization. Admitting mistakes, apologizing, I think it's a good practice. Okay. And of course, in dealing with a crisis, it's always good to also show that, to show emotions. And organizations can say that they are disappointed, they can be displeased over a situation, and explain why, right? So it's one way to build trust. It's one way to frame messages at the same time. And of course, the key learning point, especially for crisis situations, is really about we cannot assume that people know what we are doing. That's one assumption that's very dangerous. Always, if you are taking steps to solve a problem, make sure that you describe those steps. What are we doing to solve a problem? What are the steps that we are taking, and so on. I think the current health situation is a clear example of how the health authorities are showing that, describing the challenges that they face, describing the situation, describing what they know about the disease, and then telling people exactly what they are doing at hospital levels, at clinic levels, and so on. And then of course, after they've explained that, they then say, what can people, the men in the street, the men and women in the street can do to help fight this together, and so on. So you can see that the telling people what steps to be taken is really quite important. Okay, and of course, it's important to also explain steps taken to ensure that a mistake or an error doesn't happen again, because the key thing to remember is organizations are imperfect. All organizations are run by human beings. Errors can happen, mistakes can happen. But if there are corrective measures and effective corrective measures need to be taken, don't hesitate to share what those corrective measures are that are being taken. So that's one way to say that we've learned from those mistakes, and you're putting in place measures to ensure that something doesn't, mistakes don't get repeated. Okay. Also important to talk about how we plan to keep people informed about progress, right? It's important to show, it's not just platitudes, giving people information and telling people what we think they want to hear is the worst thing to do. What this point really is about is telling people how we plan to keep them informed, right? Because the engagement has started, we want to use that opportunity to build the connection with people. So keep telling people what you, how you plan to keep them informed, and so on. And of course, we should always reinforce our appreciation for them. Okay. One thing about crisis comms is that as we do crisis comms, one of the things that we need to remember is that as we prepare, as we learn from the mistakes made by others, we really need to be we need to understand the importance of preparing for crises. But many practitioners have found that in preparing for crises, they have learned the benefits of preparing for a crisis, because when we are preparing for, or when we are prepared for crisis, sometimes we are on the alert. We are able to detect what issues are, what underlying issues that can be addressed. We are able to detect what can be uncovered, and if we deal with issues early on, that issues that are uncovered early on, there are chances that those issues can be handled so effectively that crisis does not happen. So we really are looking at a complete cycle. As we prepare for crisis, we are really looking at preventing crisis from happening. Okay. So how do we then establish, how then do we create organizations that are prepared for crisis? Really is about establishing a crisis management culture. So these crisis management culture is establishing the processes, the mindsets within a company to be on the lookout for difficulties, to be looking out for opportunities to prevent issues from turning into a crisis. Okay, these steps includes having having regular meetings to establish what are the areas of the weaknesses, what is the company, what are the weak points of a company, what are the weak points of the operations, and so on. These it's important because understanding the gaps, understanding the weaknesses will help an organization be prepared for times when things might go wrong. Okay, this includes conducting annual research to establish. It's always good to know a company's own reputation. What we think we are good at may not be what we are known for. So it's always important to have an objective view of how people view your organization. What do they say about your organization, and how do they feel about your organization from a personal standpoint as well as from a working standpoint, because this will reveal to us how much goodwill we have from external parties. And in times of crisis, that goodwill is something that we need to tap into. Okay, a crisis management culture is also always on the alert, on the lookout for warning signs. Right, most problems that afflict companies usually stem from some underlying issue. So it's always good to be able to be on the lookout for what those pitfalls are, what those areas are. I mean, to give you a simple example, if I were the owner of a childcare center, right, one of the key areas would be that the childcare center is a safe environment for children, obviously, that it is child friendly. Not only is it child friendly, but the place must be sanitized regularly, right? It should be kept germ free as much as possible. So these are areas that an organization should be looking out for. You know your own operations well, know what are the areas that could pose a threat, and then work in eliminating those threats. Establishing a crisis management culture also requires people to conduct regular crisis management meetings. In daily operations, people are so busy with delivering products and services and just meet the day-to-day operations. But I think people should not neglect that that they should always find time to have a meeting, or to include within regular meetings some topics that talks about managing business issues, operational issues, and so on. Because if you overlook these things, again, like I said, issues and crises have a way of creeping up on people when they least expect it. So it's always good to have regular meetings, and to have meetings, to use opportunities at the meetings to bring up such opportunities to discuss any emerging underlying issues and crises. Okay, in order to have a crisis management culture, it's really about having the political will to also set aside, the activities, right? And to have activities, you really need to budget. So if in certain organizations, in order for things to happen, you must set aside budgets. If your organization is such an organization, then it's important to budget for activities that helps people do crisis management, crisis issues and crisis management. We also need to work to facilitate and improve communications with key stakeholders within the company and external agencies. This is understanding who your stakeholders are, how best to reach them, and how best to communicate with them, right? What's the fastest way to communicate with them, and so on. In an organization, in any organization for that matter, you need to have crisis management plans, right? These are plans that helps an organization know what to do should a crisis happens. And these crisis management plans should be updated regularly because if there are changes in operations, changes in the environment and so on, it should be reflective. And of course, for spokespersons, it's important that anyone who represents a company in talking to external parties, especially to the news media, should be media trained. Media training here involves understanding how to listen empathetically, to understand how to handle media questions, to understand how to speak appropriately, to understand how to use the correct phraseologies and so on. Now we've come to the part where we talk about dealing with external publics. This, again, like I said, one thing that I'm constantly reminded is in dealing with a crisis, we shouldn't start wondering how to deal with the crisis only when there is a crisis. In other words, we should be prepared. In any organization, in any large organization, it has to be treated as part and parcel of your daily operations. Organizations that find that they have a less difficult times are organizations which already understand how to tap into goodwill, how they have created goodwill with their stakeholders, I feel would have an easier time in communicating, especially during a crisis. Now, some good pointers on how we can cultivate goodwill with key publics is really about understanding the people that we work with, the people who buy our products and services, and understanding how they think and feel about our company, for example. We also need to ensure that for any company that wants to build goodwill, it really has to remember that it has to be socially responsible. How does it conduct itself? What do we mean by being socially responsible? We are really looking at behaving in a way that is respectful of how society expects companies to behave in. Do we pollute the environment? Do we use economic environmentally sustainable production methods and so on, or do we just focus on making money and not and damaging the environment as it happens? We also need to conduct ongoing public relations programs with various stakeholders. These can take different forms. We can have various means of outreach. We need to reach out to people through communications, through in the provision of our services. We need to actually have a relationship, in other words, establish a dialogue with the people that we want to work with, so that we understand them better and to understand what their needs are and so on. As part of cultivating goodwill, it's always important to pay attention to warning signs, right? What are the things that point to possible disagreements? What are the times when we are likely to fail our clients and so on? These are important. Feedback, warning signs can come from even feedback from customers about dissatisfaction with customer service, for example. So it's always important to listen. It's very important to listen empathetically and to see whether or not if there's a pattern of complaints, how then can we deal with these complaints? What are the root causes of those complaints? It's about being patient and really listening with an open ear and listening with objectivity, not listening, not prejudging the information that we get, not prejudging feedback that we get from the ground. It's very important to listen empathetically and of course try to understand, listen with understanding. We also need to measure and evaluate our communication activities. Every time there's an opportunity to communicate messages, it's important to see if there is reactions on the ground. What are those reactions? How are people reacting? What should we do in response to those reactions? And of course, again, a good example in the COVID-19 environment is to explain to people how difficult decisions are being arrived. I remember the communications from the health ministry that when we went from DORSCON yellow to orange, it was a very clear explanation of what the DORSCON system was. It was explaining the conditions that are being monitored by the DORSCON, the criteria. And then the health ministries, the health authorities rather, took the effort to explain what were the triggers of changing the color system, and of course what were the conditions to make changing. And when it's well communicated, people didn't argue with the decision. How the media, how the public reacted is a different story altogether. I mean, there was panic buying and so on. But I think in the aftermath of that, people are understanding that the authorities have a tough job ahead of them, but they are managing the situation with the cooperation of people, and that people should not take things into their own hands. When in doubt, of course, seek advice, find out from people how best to conduct oneself. Okay. Last but not least, we're looking at best practices in preparing and preventing and planning for a crisis. Okay, these include plan for crisis. In other words, regardless of the industry that we are in, it's always good to ask ourselves what are the things that could possibly go wrong. And then plan for contingency actions around those things. Remember, as you plan for crisis, also remember to understand what are the effects. If something were to go wrong, who will be affected and how they will be affected is important to bear that in mind. Okay, we need to set communication objectives for potential crises. In other words, for every areas of weaknesses, ask ourselves, how can we, what are the things that we need to establish? What are the things that we need to do if certain types of crises happen? We also need, in analyzing channel choices, we are looking at what channels, what communication channels to use, and how best to use it, how best to quickly reach, get messages out, and so on. If organization has unfortunately, this point, assigning a different team, it shows that if an organization tends to have a lot of crises to handle, sometimes it's helpful to rotate the teams that manage those crises, because it could be emotionally and draining, tiring, and so on. So it's best also to assign different teams. A new team to handle a different crisis might be fresher. They might have the fresh perspectives, and they may have the fresh mindset to be able to handle a crisis. And of course, it helps to plan for centralization. What this means is basically, in handling a crisis, it's good to have a team that manages all communications and so on. The team should be coordinate with other stakeholders within an organization, and then only the team managing a crisis should be the ones communicating with external parties. Otherwise, there'll be a stream of messages that go out from the same. We don't want a situation where different messages go out to different stakeholders at different times, because that will create further confusion. Okay, now so we're still on the topic of preparing, preventing, and planning for a crisis. It's always good to have a formal plan, a plan that can be put together within an organization. Right, this could be shared on the intranet. This could be shared through documents, for example, that are kept somewhere where people can have easy access to that formal plan. A formal plan is useful because in a situation where a large organization has to handle a crisis, if people use the same plan, chances are they will know what to do, and it is a way of coordinating efforts from each stakeholders within the organization. Now, typically what is found in a formal plan includes the following. It could be a list of people you need to notify in an emergency. It also spells out some instructions as to dealing with news media, for example. If news reporters were to call or to email, for example, what should we do? Who should we channel those questions to? Who should we channel those communications to, and so on. The plan should also spell out instructions of how to notify employees in a crisis situation. What channels to use? Do we call them on their mobile phones, and so on? The plan should also indicate a location that can serve as a crisis headquarters within an organization. So it should be a centrally located room, for example, that can be used as a crisis headquarters. There can also be, as part of the plan, the plan should have a description of the plan itself. What is this plan? How can it be used? How can it be helpful, and so on? It's important to have a description of the plan. Okay. Moving along, we looked at some best practices. We've looked at how internal communications is important to get people within an organization to be prepared for crises. We looked at how crisis preparation can also help a company become more crisis ready and also prevent crises from happening. The next topic we are moving on to is about crisis plan evaluation. Now that we have a crisis plan, we cannot assume that a plan is perfect. We cannot assume that a plan is ironclad. So it's important to remember that we have to learn to evaluate our crisis plan, right? So what are some things that we should look out for to help us fine-tune our crisis plan? Includes the following. These are some questions. I won't read out all these questions, but these questions are useful to help us understand, number one, whether or not we were able to talk to the people or engage people that we wanted to talk to, right? Did we get our messages out? Did we get the appropriate response? Did we get the feedback that we wanted? Okay, do the people who we communicate with know what they were to do, and how would we react? How should we react to requests for further information, and so on? So these are some critical questions that we need to consider in evaluating our crisis. Okay, now for crisis evaluation, really we need it's all about getting feedback. It's all about measuring and tracking ways the crisis has affected our business, right? So for example, how much of business has been impacted? Is market share been affected? Is the share price affected, and so on? So the crisis evaluation is not just about understanding whether or not we were able to contain the fallout of a crisis, but also to look at the bigger picture. How did it affect our business? How did it affect our reputation? How does it affect the trust? How does it affect the feelings, the emotional feelings that people have towards our organization or our brand? Is an important part of looking at crisis evaluation, right? To help us better evaluate the crisis really is about understanding how to monitor and evaluate the crisis, right? The monitoring, monitoring really requires us to look at ways of tracking sales, for example. All of these things that are happening, the outcomes, various outcomes of various efforts should be looked at to see the bigger picture, because as you sales, profits, market share, all of these things, what people are saying about us in the media, what people are talking about on social media platforms, all of these things provide clues as to how, whether or not we are effective in handling a crisis. Did we communicate the right messages? Do people believe us? Do they find us believable? And so on. I do have to share that when we talk about issues and crises, these are top line measures that we have been touching on. Many of you who are participating in this webinar may come from different sectors, may come from different industries. So it's always important to look at these measures and see how these measures apply in your context. Okay, it has to be contextualized. It is not these are just some best practices, some learnings, and so on that we're sharing. They are very generic in nature. They are not they are prescriptive, but they are not definitely instructive, because, like I said, you come from various industries, and sometimes depending on the industries that you come from, some of these measures may need to be tweaked to fit the context in which your industry operates in. Okay, there are some things that we need to sometimes in dealing with, in monitoring a crisis. It's also good to take time out to conduct focus groups. This is these are sessions where you invite external parties, external stakeholders to sit at a round table and to discuss a topic that you may have set for them, to get a feedback on what they think and feel about a topic, or how the handling of a particular issue or crisis was, in their opinion, what were their perceptions of that handling. So it's useful to conduct such sessions to get a clearer picture of what was done correctly, and what was not done, or what could have been done better. Okay, and also remember to use an internet monitoring service, because these there are such commercial entities that will help you look at data from internet traffic to help you get feedback, right? To see, of course, it's keyword search and so on, to find whether or not the company's name was mentioned. If there was mention of the company, what was mentioned, and so on, because all of these feedback would be useful for a company to understand perceptions of the stakeholders. Now, another thing to remember, I mean, as we monitor a situation, it's always important to be open-minded, to say, are there things that we can adjust, right? How can we increase or decrease the level of communications? What is the appropriate thing to do? Because no management of crises cannot be fixed. It cannot be static. You have to look at the situation and then ask yourselves, are the things that we're doing effective? And if they are effective, can we then adjust, right? Do we do more or less of anything that would be helpful to the situation? Like I said, it's highly contextual, right? Depending on the industries that you come from. A lot of these methodologies are best practices, and it's important to be flexible in your application of such principles as you handle a crisis. I would say yes, if the situation warrants it. If for example, I think you remember the Air Asia Surabaya air crash. In such instances, I think Tony Fernandez took the lead. He was the representative of Air Asia, being the top person. He stepped up. Okay, when he stepped up, I think there was general admiration for him, because there was I think in such a situation, it takes courage, right? Most people will find it's a difficult situation to talk about deaths and so on. But he stepped up. He took a decisive decision to face the press. He took difficult questions, but also he took the opportunity to express his humanity. He expressed sympathies. He said that it was a difficult time for his airline because of the crash, because of the deaths. He expressed sympathy. He apologized, and so on. So in such an instance, it is important that the top person address the issue. If it's a smaller issue that doesn't quite involve lives and deaths, then perhaps maybe a product that someone suitably senior in the management, not necessarily the CEO, maybe a VP or a director, product director, and so on, could helm to face the press rather. So I think it really is contextual, and it's important that the company must be comfortable and decide who is the appropriate person. Like I said, if it's a life and death matter, it's always important to use the people right at the very top. If it's a product recall, product failure, maybe the head of design, the head of a particular branch can represent the company in those instances. The question, this one really, again, like I said, depends on the organizations that you come from. If you are an oil refinery, for example, or if you come from an industry that is crisis prone, perhaps, or if you come from an industry where lives and deaths where there are life and death matters, I think in that case, a good, you must look at the revenues, right? How much money you are earning, for example, and decide maybe a percentage of that, or a reasonable percentage should be set aside. Like I said, this is not there are no easy sort of no formulas to doing this, but you need to look at your own company, see how prone you are to crises, and see how much it will affect your reputation and your ability to provide products and services, and then decide at the highest level an appropriate budget to be set based on earnings and so on, to and of course it has to be realistic, the budget. You shouldn't be setting aside so much money that it's disproportionate to what your company is earning. I think this is situational. Like I said, if it is life and death issues, the company must understand what is okay, if information is to be shared, to be honest, right? Does that sharing of that information, is there a potential for that to cause harm? If there is a potential of causing further harm to people, to the organization itself, then the question is, then maybe the decisions need to be made. See, in information that we share, we always, perhaps a good start would be to think of the greater good. If telling people the truth helps the greater good, then by all means do so. But if there's always a potential for causing further harm, I give you an example. We see those Hollywood movies. There's a hostage situation. The bank robber is in the banking hall. The entrances are sealed. The people trapped inside are all hostages. And then you have a reporter inside the bank, and then he's telling people through his radio broadcast, oh, the guy is having a gun, he's standing over where, and so on. Can you imagine how will the police handle a situation like that when someone inside the building is giving, the robbers themselves can also hear that information. I mean, this is a bit exaggerated example, but like I said, information that is shared that has a potential to cause further harm, or worst of all, cause further misunderstandings, can then trigger, like, these are information that perhaps is sensitive. In handling sensitive information, then the company may have a policy. What is that policy in dealing with such sensitive information, right? Like I said, it's not about being so naive that we have to tell the whole world. Like I said, there are sometimes, if telling people some information may expose the company to legal liabilities, for example. In that case, there are other things that would protect. There are legal protections that the company can turn to say, oh, some information is company sensitive, company confidential. This cannot be shared under any circumstances, and make sure that you have those protections. Otherwise, like I said, but the company must weigh the pros and cons, right? In divulging information, do we do good? Are we doing it for the greater good, or are we exposing ourselves to unnecessary legal difficulties and so on? So the company must, again, it's very highly contextual, but honesty is a good starting point. It's always a good starting point. People sometimes, when they hear that if a company admits its mistake and expresses that it is sorry, people will be more forgiving. People will not be ready to troll you, right? If you are a company that comes across as arrogant, I don't care what you say, we'll do what we like. We are a big and mighty, powerful company. This is how we operate, take it or leave it. If you, as an organization, gives people that sense, then good luck to you, because you will have a tough time handling communications in any situation, because the public is not the public has a viewpoint, and you can do this at the detriment of your own reputation. Yeah. In a situation like that, it's always important that someone within the organization would collate, right? To collate it in real time. This information can be collated, and then the team handling the communications must then categorize such information. Like if this is it a operational matter? Is it a customer service matter? Categorize it correctly, make sense of this information and perhaps have regular updates of what the company is doing. In other words, you may have daily communications even right at the end of the day, a business day, for example, maybe by 4 p.m. every day, you acknowledge, thank you, we have received feedback. That means you acknowledge this feedback, but have regular updates. But like I said, if in a crisis situation, the complaints and things might come in at different times and it may be unfolding. It is important. It would be a bit counterproductive to be responding to every complaint at every point. I mean, if you have the manpower, by all means do so. But I tell you, it will be a drain on the team. Best to collate and then maybe at a fixed time every day and share with people. Every day at 4 p.m. we have regular updates. We will tell people what we have, what we are doing, how we are monitoring the situation, what we are doing to follow up on the situation, and then have a regular update at a particular time of the day and tell people that, so that they will know that, okay, at 4 p.m. there will be some statements and then we'll look out for that. Right now for COVID-19, that's exactly what the Ministry of Health is doing, right? Every day we look at numbers of new cases. Of this number of new cases, how many are imported, how many are local transmissions, and so on. And then there's also feedback data on the contact tracing and so on. And this is done on a regular basis. Same thing. So this is, like I said, and do it regularly. I can't say every day. It really depends on the complexity of the situation. But when there are regular updates, there's a sense that people who are anxious will know that yes, you are on top of things. I mean, like I said, in communicating, I think also when the government first announced the first death, the second death, and the third death, it was announced with respect, with empathy, and so on. And again, like I said, it's you know, while they say one person died, 2 persons died, immediately they acknowledge that there is grief, that this is hard news, it impacts families and so on. So they were very respectful in the way they conveyed that news, and which is the right thing to do. You can't just say it's a statistics, it's just another number. No, 3 deaths in Singapore are 3 deaths too many. So they are respectful of that. They're very, and I think we hats off to an organization that shows its human side as well in conveying such bad news and hard information to share. I would like to say that in an ideal situation, right, any organization, if you have the manpower and the resources, sometimes 2 things can be happening. One is that any outbreak of bad news happening on social media alone that has not caught the attention of the news media, for example, can be handled. Maybe 1 or 2 people can be dedicated to handling that feedback. Look at the amount of chatter on social media, for example, and then maybe issue a statement on those same platforms that the bad news has been, is spreading. So for example, if there's if it's on Facebook and there's some negative news, it's okay to not jump in, but rather to post a message saying that we are acknowledging that this is happening, and share with people that are concerned, that we are concerned, and this is some active measures that we're taking. Some simple statements that would address that on its own. In dealing with the media, deal with the media when the media makes inquiries. It is, I think from my own experience, it's highly unlikely that the media will write a story about your company or your organization without even contacting you. So generally, they would probably say, we are running a story in tomorrow's newspapers or an online edition, and this story involves your company. We would like a statement from your company. Yes, then you can deal with that media question when it arises. But this is a perfect scenario where you have the relevant manpower handling social media and the news media. In smaller organizations, sometimes they don't have people, they don't even have comms people, right? So maybe you may have a PR firm that you're engaging to handle external inquiries as and when. So that might be a little bit difficult to handle, but generally the comms people should address social media as well as news media at the same time. I would say that it really depends on the complexity of a situation. Like let's say, for example, if you are an airline, right, and there's an air crash, there will be investigators on the ground collecting information. That information may be coming in drips and drabs, or it may be coming in one chunk. So in situations like that, you can, I think, literally say that when information comes in, it will be shared, right? But maybe you must factor some time for the company to analyze that information first, the communicators within a company must analyze information, make sense of it first before they communicate. In other words, there shouldn't be a mad rush to release information. There must always be internal checks and measures within an organization to make sense of information first before sharing it. So that's one. And that time frame that is needed to make sense of information determines how often you make those updates. So if you know that if it's life and death situation where it's hour by hour updates, then the company can release information maybe on the hour, but 1 hour later, so that there's time for the company to make sense of information first before sharing it, right? Now, if it's not life and death where it could be end of work day, end of, even say, we will be making announcements every 2 days, every 3 days. As long as you have an understanding of how the situation is unfolding and how you are managing it, it's okay. And if it's not life and death, you can always say there'll be updates, regular updates every 1 day, every 2 days, whatever. Then you can schedule. Again, you must know your own industry, you must know your own company well enough to be able to decide on the timing of such release. Also, if again, like I said, this is entirely in an ideal situation where you have more resources, is to monitor the feedback. If really day after day, minute by minute, hour by hour, that people are clamoring for information, this tells you that your information, you're perhaps not managing it as well. So maybe that in the first few days of an incident, for example, you need to have more regular information sharing and more detailed sharing. Hopefully that should answer some questions, which then means that you don't have to make such regular updates as often. Okay, so again, it's dependent on your resources that's available to you. So you need to know your organization well enough, your operations, and then work within that to determine how often you make your sharing. All thanks to technology. I feel emails, again, emails could be painting the big picture. Emails are important, emails are useful. So you have an email that provides more details in terms of policy and so on. But where immediate responses are needed, I think maybe it's useful to have a work chat, a Telegram chat or WhatsApp chat to provide information. Again, Telegram and WhatsApp can have mirror versions on laptops where you need to type out long messages. That can be done quite quickly. And of course, get your staff to buy in. Some staff, I know they say, oh, my company doesn't pay for my mobile bill, so I don't want to be, try to explain to them the importance that this is only, it's on a need to know. We will only contact you only when we think it's urgent enough and so on. So chats are useful. I mean, these are real-time chats. So that's one good way of getting information out quickly. And of course, a lot of Skype, Zoom, like the one we're using now. These are various means of getting messages across quite effectively. Yeah.